It's a great pleasure to welcome you to St Paul's Cathedral for this service, which is part of our Mind of the Maker series, where we're interviewing different well-known people who are involved in creativity and asking them about their understanding of God, their faith, their religion, and how it relates to what they do in their creative work. Today, it's a great pleasure to welcome Clarissa Dickson Wright, who has become enormously popular through her cooking programs, which began with Two Fat Ladies. I think, was that in the early 90s?
It was in sort of mid-90s, 95 was the first one.
95. And so we're partly looking at this in terms of being part of the Easter season, when we remember God's recreation in the person and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So before I begin interviewing Clarissa properly, we shall have a prayer and a reading from our presenter.
Let us pray. God, who brought your Son, Jesus Christ, from death to new life, we thank you that you have reformed us in your image through the life, death, and resurrection of your Son. We pray that we may be inspired by your creative love to live with courage and imagination, to turn from those destructive habits and thoughts which lead us to deny the gifts you have given us. We pray that through sharing our experiences of your love for us, we may be given confidence and hope through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. A reading from St. John's Gospel. Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, "I am going fishing." They said to him, "We will go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" They answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead.
Now that's one of the traditional readings that we have at Easter, when Jesus appears to his disciples. And perhaps what's the most amazing thing about it is that these are the men who betrayed him, and yet he cooks them breakfast. He shows that great hospitality. And so I just wondered, as a starting point, what your experiences were eating as a child with your family or at school, and whether hospitality was something that you recall from that time.
Well, the only place in my fairly over-the-top household that we didn't have World War III was at the meal table.
Right.
My father, and it used to pain me to have to say this, was the gourmet in the family. And we ate things, I mean, an awful lot of my friends come and say, we had our first avocado pear in your house, or our first smoked salmon, or things like that. And we had this cook who was really my mentor, because my mother was a thin, elegant woman who bought her clothes in Paris, and the cook weighed 20 stone, who came from Derbyshire. She trained at Chatsworth. And she had this wonderful thing that when the children were told they could order what they wanted for lunch, provided they ate what they were given in the evening.
Right.
And so we learned to eat everything. But yeah, food was, I think, probably the only peaceful place in the house was at mealtimes. And I just loved the thought of Jesus cooking breakfast on the fire.
Yes, barbecued fish first thing in the morning.
Delicious, freshly caught.
So eating was a good experience in childhood, but it was in the midst of quite an abusive background.
Oh, we had a lot of strife and turmoil. My father, although he was the most brilliant surgeon, was a very violent and abusive alcoholic. And it tinged the whole house with that feeling of fear, you know, waiting for the other shoe to drop. You never knew when it was going to erupt, but you did know that it wasn't going to erupt at mealtimes.
Right.
Unless perhaps the fish was overcooked.
And so how did you cope with that very tense, potentially always erupting in the background?
Well, I did, when I was a child, I think what the British always do in the face of adversity, you know, you're gung-ho, you stand up to it. You know, nobody's going to push me around, and remember to duck at the right moment. But obviously, later on, I became very like him because I took to drinking, and I drank 2 bottles of gin a day, and the rest. And, you know, how I'm still in one piece is really quite beyond me.
And you were able to function even though you were drinking that much alcohol?
I've always had the belief, you know, this thing of all of us have one talent. I mean, we may have other talents, but we've always got that one core talent. And in my case, mine is cooking. And so, I mean, I cooked the best meal I've ever cooked in my life in blackout. I have no recollection of it at all. It was only when I went back to find out what I'd cooked that, you know, I remember picking up the first saucepans, and then I woke up in the bed in the house I was cooking in the next morning. It was a professional job. And I went down to the kitchen, and there was this immaculate kitchen, and I thought, uh-oh. And then I heard my employer coming down the stairs with all her dogs. She used to sleep surrounded by her dogs. And there was no other way out of the kitchen. And so she came through the door, and I was like a rabbit in the headlights. And she said, "Clarissa, such a triumph. The entire county will be talking about it." And I said, "I'm so glad. Thank you, madam." And, you know, it took me, I was 5 years into sobriety, so about 8 years to go back and find out what I cooked. And it was 10 courses.
Gosh.
And some of them were really quite complicated.
And so you always maintained kind of high levels of performance, even when you were...
Yes, everybody
otherwise...
thinks of an alcoholic as being the sort of chap in the dirty Macintosh in the gutter. But an awful lot of us function really quite well. And of course, the job is the last thing to go.
Yes.
Because it's the job that pays for the gin.
Yes.
And you'd be amazed how many recipes I used to cook with gin. And they'd say, "You're right, it is terribly subtle. You can hardly taste the gin." And, you know, what I'd been doing was grinding up juniper berries. To this day, I can't stand the smell of juniper berries.
Really? And so that drive to drink all the time was part of also trying to escape things that were too painful to deal with when you were sober. Would that be?
Yes, I mean, I do believe that alcoholism is an illness, and an inherited illness. And in my case, there's an awful lot of it in my extended family. But I think also what it does is it desensitizes the pain.
Yes.
And the pain of my mother dying, just when I thought we were winning, was just too much, really.
And at what point in your life was that? How old were you when?
I was 25.
Right. And so until that point, you'd lived with alcohol quite easily, as it were?
I didn't drink.
You didn't drink at all?
I didn't drink at all.
No.
I was not going to be an alcoholic like so many others in my family. And what I did was I was a workaholic.
Right.
You know, because
yes.
I think it was a young man who was actually becoming a priest who said, you know, it's like having 10 pots and 9 lids. You're always sort of having
yes, yeah.
keep a careful eye on what's boiling over. And in my case, it was work. And I was very successful. I was a successful barrister. You know, I got platitudes from people who were in a position to know and, you know, the girl most likely to succeed. And, you know, I just worked all the hours that God sent.
Yes, yes.
I was very boring.
So your life took a very sharp turn after your mother and your father died at that point as well?
My father died 6 months later.
Right.
But by that time I was already drinking.
Okay.
It was almost as though I'd done all the things I'd done to prove a point to my father. You know, rub his nose in the fact that I was a success and to please my mother. And then there was nobody to show off to anymore.
Right.
So what's the point, you know?
So you lost that sense of purpose in your life?
Yeah, I
Yes.
lost any sense of purpose at all. And I remember saying to God, you know, okay, God, let's play Russian roulette.
Right.
And I got to the stage where every bottle I opened, you know, was this going to be the one that killed me? And I remember years later a priest saying to me, whatever made you think, Clarissa, that God would load the revolver?
Right, yes, yes. So although at the time you felt that your life was without value, and in a sense you challenged God on that front.
Yeah.
Believing that God valued your life was not something that you could easily relate to.
No. I mean, it was very strange. My mother had a very secure faith. It wasn't particularly a religious faith in the sense of going to church. It was God was her friend.
Right.
And she used to go and park her car on a WA line with flashes and say, well, let's go and have lunch. And I'd say, Ma, you can't leave the car here. And she'd go, it is not for you, Clarissa, to define the perimeters of what God can and cannot do. And she would sit there eating her lunch, and you'd watch the traffic wardens going past the windows. And I'd be twitching.
Yes.
And we'd go out, and there wasn't even a ticket, you know. And she did have this very real belief that God was her friend.
And did you look at that with that faith with some kind of envy? You know.
No, I looked at it with pure, you know, sort of disdain, I think
Right.
is the word. My father was such a forceful and powerful person and an atheist. And here was my mother who, you know, she'd get black eyes and she'd get broken bones. You know, how could she be happy with her life? How could she enjoy the day or say, you know, look here, I can still move my hands, you know, or whatever. And so I used to think, oh, no, she's got it wrong.
Yes, yeah.
And, you know, if God is there. And I think I always thought God was there, but I didn't actually think that necessarily God was on the winning side.
Or that God necessarily cared about you or your mother, for example.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think I was prepared to believe that he cared about my mother, if that's what she wanted, but I certainly didn't think he cared about me.
Right, right.
And, you know, I had to do it.
Yes.
Self-do it. You know, if I didn't do it for myself, I wasn't going to ask anybody for help. Well, who were you going to ask anyway? And if I didn't do it, then it wouldn't be done. And I had to force it so that I would be a success.
Right.
And I didn't even perceive, I think, that it would have anything to do with God. You know, I suppose it was quite a black place to be.
Yes, yes.
But I was so driven with
Yes.
this workaholism and the desire to prove to my father that I didn't really think about it that much. But I didn't pray. I didn't talk to God.
And so this time in your life that was very dark and very black when you were dependent on alcohol.
Well, even before I was dependent on alcohol, yeah. I mean, once I was dependent on alcohol, at least I had the alcohol.
Yes, yes.
But it was not a fun place to be. And I remember once, before I finally got into recovery, trying to give up drinking. And I had, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks when I didn't drink. And it was really frightening. It really was. I think it's, I've been in some quite frightening situations in my life, but this was the most frightening.
Right.
Because there was nothing.
There was nothing to shield you from the pain. And
nothing to shield me from the pain, from the fear, from thoughts of, how was I going to run my life? And my mother always used to say, leave it to God, Clarissa, he has a better imagination than you have. And, I wasn't prepared to accept that.
No.
If alcoholics and addicts are great control freaks. They want to control everything, not just about their own lives, but in the world in general. And, I think I used to think that if I turned over the wrong way in bed, the San Andreas fault would crumble. That I had to control everything. And if I didn't, then it just wouldn't work.
So you lived with a lot of pressure?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
And I was very aggressive and achievist. I wanted to win. Winning was always, even when I was in a state where I wasn't in any position to win anything. Winning was the important thing, but winning was down to me.
Yes, yes.
That there was nothing beyond me. And yet I must have believed in something, because I often think since that if all I thought there was out there was a hole in the ground, then I'd have gone to it.
Yes, yes.
But I wasn't going to do that, because I was brought up that, suicide was despair, and despair was the ultimate sin.
Right, right.
And so, it was down to something else to pull the trigger rather than me.
And so, living what was really a very self-destructive life.
Oh, about self-destructive. I mean, it always amazes me that I'm still in one piece.
Yes, yes.
I was always turning over cars, real Dukes of Hazzard flips into ditches. Oh, God. I remember a small 3-year-old saying to me, looking at this upside-down car, because his mother had come to collect me, we drive our cars the other way up. And always pushing the excesses. I didn't really do drugs because they didn't appeal to me. I mean, I took amphetamine so I could stay awake longer to drink more.
Right.
But it was not there was no enjoyment in it. I mean, whereas, people drink, have a glass of wine or something for pleasure. It wasn't like that. It wasn't about the taste of the alcohol. It was what it would do. And, I think that, I didn't believe that I would be lucky enough to die.
Gosh.
Early.
Yes, yes.
And so I just kept on and on. And in the end, it was just, there's a saying about being sick and tired of being sick and tired. And I just had no energy, no hope, no nothing. I think it's the absence of hope. It was the Inquisition, wasn't it, that had a torture where they let you out of your cell and you thought you were going to escape. And you weren't, and everybody said that was the worst.
Yes, yes.
Because the hope was removed. So.
And what then led you to a point of ending that self-destructiveness?
God.
God.
I mean, I remember I was cleaning the burnt jam off these quarry tiles, and if you consider that the Frontisclithis aqueduct is held up by burnt sugar, that's what holds it together and has done for 300 years. It's not easy to clean burnt jam off quarry tiles. And because I was on my knees, and because I really felt that I couldn't go on even doing what I was doing, I remember saying, okay, God, if you're up there, please do something, because I simply can't go on. And then there was this sequence of events which weren't anything to do with me at all. I mean, the very next day, I was taken away in a police car from the place where I was working at Wootton Underwood for a breathalyzer I don't even remember taking. So I certainly didn't turn up in court. And I remember I was driving down this very long drive of this stately home as the house party was coming up it for the weekend. And I was the cook.
Right.
And sort of going like that out of the back of the police car. And then there was this whole sequence of events. And I wasn't kicking and screaming against them because I didn't even realise they were happening until I looked back on them.
Yes.
And then the next thing I knew, really, I was in an alcoholic treatment centre and going to AA meetings. And I've been sober ever since, and that was 26 years ago. So I have no doubt whatsoever that it was God.
Yes, yeah.
And I don't know that I necessarily, in the beginning, when I realised that I actually liked that. That, you know, it had been done for me.
Yes, yeah.
And it was back to leave it to God, Clarissa. He has a better imagination than you do, because I had no idea what I was going to do with the rest of my life. My first birthday in sobriety was my 40th birthday. I remember this school friend of mine sent me a card, you know, one's life begins at 40.
Yes.
Saying, may this be the only cliché of your life. And then what happened to me in the intervening years was not something I could ever have dreamed of. And if anybody told me that my life was going to be what it was, and I'd have just looked at them as though they were mad.
Yes, yes. We're now going to have a hymn sung by a baritone, Dear Lord and Father of Mankind, which I know has particular significance for you.
When I was in my treatment centre, this friend of mine and I used to go down to the little church in the village, and for some reason they sang it every week. And quite often we were the only people in there.
Right.
And the organist would say, obviously wanting her tea, to the deaconess, you know, shall we just sing the first and last verses? And she'd go, no, it's a beautiful hymn, let's sing all the verses. And it was only after I had it as one of my things on Desert Island Disc that I discovered it was written by the Quaker poet James Whittier against the evils of alcohol.
Ah, right.
And that it used to begin, O Lord, dear Lord and Father of mankind, forgive our fuddled ways. And I still love it. I shall have it at my funeral.
It's a very resonant hymn, yes. So that still small voice of calm, is that something that came to you in treatment as you began to confront those things?
I think it came after treatment. I think it came gradually over the next 5 years of recovery. Because I think that, you know, my life up until that point had been so turbulent that that's what I wanted, that still small voice of calm. And that is very much to me what God is.
Right.
You know, in all the things that I've done in my intervening years, and some of them have been quite exciting.
Yes.
It's still that moment of peace, that moment of calm, that is the best thing.
Yes. Where you feel most present to God, or God most present to you. Yes.
You know, sometimes sort of out in the open, you know, it's, with the exception of places like this, it's not so much churches as the countryside, or looking at the sea, or one of the great waterfalls that is important to me, and that I feel closer to God.
So being part of God's creation, seeing God's creation, is what helps you perhaps live creatively yourself.
Yes, very possibly. After all, a lot of the things growing about you are things you can cook with.
Yes, yes.
You know, whether they're actual fruit and vegetables or herbs or whatever. You know, I still get a huge amount of pleasure out of cooking and out of food. And when you invent something, for want of a better word, when you create a combination of flavours that perhaps, well, you don't think anybody has done before, or when you get a really beautiful piece of beef or a perfect potato, you think, when did you last go, over a potato? Not easy these days.
No, not at all.
That I think, yeah, well done. Good old God.
So cooking is part of the way in which you engage with the creative spirit of God, and in a sense it sounds like you forget yourself in that moment.
Yes, I think that's very right. I think, you know, I always say that cooking is my only talent. Certainly my most natural talent. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But it's something that I was never taught. It's something that comes from within me. You know, it must be wonderful to be able to write a piece of music or paint a picture. None of those things I can do. But I can cook. You know, and if I have a dinner party, most of the time I quite happily put the food on the table, say have a lovely time and go off to bed. You know, because I've done my bit.
Yes.
I think I'm a natural domestic servant. You know, so when you get those bits in the New Testament where, you know, when I read about the Last Supper, you know, I can almost taste the lamb. And I just hope that, you know, it was well cooked and that the bread was well prepared, or the unleavened bread was well prepared. Because it is something that endlessly, you know, every year, a few years ago, well, it's quite a few years ago now, I decided that I was really only going to eat seasonally.
Yes.
And the difference it makes to wait for the first asparagus, to wait for the first tomatoes to ripen at home, is something, you know, it keeps my love of it alive. And I do believe that God must have had a great deal of fun creating things. I mean, I know we all came out of the oceans and things like that, but I like to think of, you know, God sitting up there thinking, no, I don't quite like that tomato, or I don't quite like that strawberry. Let's just twitch it a bit.
Yes, yes.
And, you know, as God can do anything, why not?
I mean, you talk about cooking as a God-given talent. I mean, many people would say that you're a very gifted person in lots of areas, in that you had a very strong academic background, you're a barrister, and it might be said by some people that, you know, society values the intellect over something creative like cooking.
Well, when I got sober, I went back to the law.
Oh, yes.
Because I had no money. That's quite a regular occurrence in my life. I'm rather better at spending money than most people. And So I'd been running books for cooks, which I found quite by accident. I mean, that was another sort of, you know, leave it to God. Because I was walking down the Portobello Road, and this friend of mine who'd been a Valium addict had a panic attack. And he saw this sign, and the sign was only out for one day, because she left it out and it got nicked, saying Annie's Restaurant at Books for Cooks. And so we went in there and had a cup of tea. And then I thought, what a lovely place, and I kept going back. And then one day, the woman who owned the shop had been told by her doctor to go away and have a rest because she was too stressed. And the woman who was going to run the shop rang up to say she'd broken her leg and couldn't do it. And I found myself saying, "Don't worry, Heidi, I'll run the shop for you." And I thought, I was still in the halfway house of my treatment centre.
Right.
I remember after a couple of weeks, she went off, leaving me with all the bank mandates and things. And I was really scared. And the telephone rang, and I picked it up. And it was Elizabeth David. Now, I'm of that generation. And I dropped the telephone. And when I got it again, I picked it up, and she said, "Are you all right?" And I said, I didn't know her.
No.
And I said, "Well, it's rather like, for someone of my generation, picking up the telephone, and it was God." I remember saying this to her. And so after that, she used to ring up and she'd say, "God calling." After that, I thought, well, I can do this.
Yes.
If I can talk to Elizabeth David, I can do this. And then, unfortunately, Heidi got well and came back. And I thought, well, I better go back to the law and make some money, because, you don't make a lot of money running a bookshop.
No.
Somebody else's bookshop at that. So I went back to the law, and I hated it, because I'd become a lawyer, I'd become a barrister, and I went back as a solicitor. I'd become a barrister because I hated my father and he hated lawyers. It's only further down the line I discovered the reason he hated lawyers was because he wasn't allowed to be one. So I went back to the law, and I did it for a year. I thought I must force myself to do it for a year. And then I walked away from it. I said to Heidi, I suppose you wouldn't like to give me my old job back. And she said, "Oh, I didn't like to suggest it." And so I went back, and it all really started from there. And all these people said to me, people in AA, I knew, all these people said to me, "But, all those degrees, all that education, why would you want to go back to the food world?" And I remember the senior partner of the firm of solicitors saying, "Remember, Clarissa, there is neither money nor glamour in cookery." I used to ring him up from time to time. He
Proved him wrong, yes.
And so that's what I did, and that's where I met Pat Llewellyn and went on from there. But it was, the world values things. I suppose they value education, not so much for the pure education of it these days, but for the money it can bring you.
Yes.
But, most of us live a fairly long time and spend most of our time working. And if you spend all your time just yearning for your holiday because it's a change from what you're doing and you don't like doing it, then there's something rather insane in that.
Yes. So for you, you'd say cooking is your vocation, something you're called to do.
I suppose so. I don't know, vacation sounds rather grand, but yes.
Yes.
And it's where I'm content.
Yes.
And yes, there is money, and yes, there is glamour in cookery. But that wasn't why I did it.
Now might be a good time to have our next piece of music, which is Ralph Vaughan Williams' setting of George Herbert's poem, "Love Bade Me Welcome." Are you familiar with that?
I am familiar with it, yes.
And that idea of love inviting us to feast on our own, in a sense, inability to come forward for that, but making that journey, which may resonate with
absolutely
what you've been talking about.
And quite frankly, I think when I was younger, the most appealing thought about heaven, if there is such a thing, was the fact that it would be full of feasting and laughter.
A heavenly banquet.
Banquet.
Yes. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your faith now, but before then, we're just going to have another reading from the Bible, which I know also has significance for you.
A reading from St. Matthew's Gospel. On the way to Jerusalem, Jesus was going through the region between Samaria and Galilee. As he entered a village, 10 lepers approached him. Keeping their distance, they called out, saying, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." When he saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." And as they went, they were made clean. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. He prostrated himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. And he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus asked, "Were not 10 made clean? But the other 9, where are they? Was none of them found to return and give praise to God, except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Get up and go on your way. Your faith has made you well."
So, Clarissa, would you like to say a bit about that?
I mean, that is a very important reading to me. I mean, it's the reason, I suppose, that I still formally go to church, because as I said, I don't necessarily find nowadays there's almost too much going on in the service all the time. There are no still small places.
Yes, yeah.
But I've always felt that I would want to be that one leper,
Yes.
the one who went back to say thank you.
Yes.
Because I think it's very important. I think gratitude is one of the most important of all the gifts we give to God, to remember to say thank you.
Yes.
And in Alcoholics Anonymous, one of the things that you're told to do by your sponsor from time to time is go and make a gratitude list.
Right.
And for me, I still begin my gratitude list with the fact that I know where I'm going to sleep tonight, that I will have a roof over my head, and that I will have the first thing I ever bought with the first money I ever earned when I was sober, which was a pillow. It's a swan's down pillow, and it was rather too expensive for me at the time. But as I said, I have great ability to spend money. I still have it. And I do think that gratitude keeps you sane, in my case sober, and in everybody's case the better for it. And when I forget to be grateful, which I do from time to time, I notice, the darkness twitching. So that is a very important reading to me. And I always used to think when I was young, and I used to hear it long before I started drinking, how awful it must have been for Jesus.
Yes.
That the other 9 didn't come back and say thank you. And, really it was a slap in the face. And I was determined that I would remember.
And it's clearly quite moving for you, thinking about it and talking about it, and in a sense, knowing that's your right response to God.
Yes.
Yeah.
And some days it isn't always obvious.
No.
Why you should be grateful. If you're having a bad day. And it's actually probably easier if one is a recovering alcoholic, because when I put my head on the pillow at night, if I hadn't had a drink that day, however bad the day has been, it's never been that bad. It's just something one must continuously remember to look for the good things in the day.
Yes.
And yes, it is very moving for me. I mean, I have a friend who is amazingly good at doing that, whatever the adversity. And it's I think it's a natural gift in her that I value and envy.
Because very often I think that we're taught to ask God for things and not necessarily thank God for things.
That's absolutely right.
And in our public intercessions, and I know because I'm guilty of this myself, most of the time I'm asking God for things on the behalf of the community, but it's much more often about asking than thanking.
Yes, and I think, that possibly asking God for specifics is not a good idea, because it's back to this thing about I don't know what the whole picture of my life is.
Yes.
And if I ask God for a specific and say it was given to me, I might have missed something so much better.
Yes.
You know, I used to want to be a High Court judge. And I now think about that and go, ugh. You know, and I would have been a terrible High Court judge. And the things you don't wish for. I mean, I can remember on the day that Barack Obama was first inaugurated, I was restored by Inn of Court because all my contemporaries and friends had now become benchers. And they all said it was no fun without Clarissa. And I was able to say in the address I gave that evening, I said, you know, it's obviously a great day for camels going through the eyes of needles. But in his case, it was always going to happen one day.
Yes.
In my case, this was never going to happen, and it never entered my mind that it would happen. And
So
I was being quite happy enough just to go to dinner, you know.
God's plans and God's imagination is so greater than anything we could envisage for ourselves.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Just think of being driven around the nation in front of 70 million viewers worldwide in a motorcycle sidecar as a way to fame. I couldn't have thought of that one.
In terms of being part of the church and the church as a place of creativity, is that something you can identify, or do you have a more questioning approach to the
I've
church?
always had a questioning approach to everything, really. But yes, I do. I mean, you come somewhere like this, and I mean, today, they would never build something like this to God. It would always be to Mammon.
Yes.
And, you know, there are times when I feel that maybe, you know, the church, and in my case, the Catholic Church in particular, has lost its way a bit. I mean, I know that Christ said, the poor we have always with us, but he didn't actually say that we had to put them before everything else. And, you know, that I'm not really as much part of a church as I should be, perhaps. You know, perhaps I could do more, but I've always been fascinated by theology, but of all religions. And Christianity does very nicely for me because it's probably however bad the times have been for women within the Christian church, they've been a lot worse, and in some cases still are, in a lot of other religions.
Yes.
You know, this has always allocated me a soul, if nothing else.
Yes.
And I do have this belief, not because I want to have it, but because it's just there, in reincarnation, in coming back, and dealing with another set of questions in another life. I'm not saying that's what I believe.
No.
And I know that the Christian churches before, I think it was the Second Synod of Constantinople or something like that, used to allow the belief in reincarnation. And when you consider that something like 2/3 of the world believes in it, it's only the people of the book who don't. That I'm not, because I'm not really somebody who's good at accepting diktats wholesale, prepared to believe that the church has all the answers. But maybe that will come when I have more time. Who knows?
But you nevertheless feel a need for it.
Oh, I feel it's an important part of my life.
Yes.
In the sense that it's a solid foundation from which I can, you know, wander away or not. I believe very firmly in God.
Yes.
And I think I believe very firmly in the God of the Christian church. I don't necessarily always agree with the church. And given that I'm a Roman Catholic, in this particular time in the Roman Catholic Church, that's perhaps understandable.
Yes, yes. Well, we're now going to have a short time of prayer led by our presenter, and then we'll have a short conversation after that. So we're now coming to the end of our time. I just wondered, for you, how would you like to be remembered?
How would I like to be remembered? I think I'd like to be remembered for humour, for believing what I say. I've turned down a lot of money from supermarkets and things like that to go against what I believe in. I'd like to be considered a person of integrity.
Yes.
In the sense that I always stood up for my beliefs, however unpopular they might have been at the time.
Yes.
And that I said what I thought, whether people agreed with it or not. And also that I was quite happy to allow them the right to say what they thought, whether I agreed with it or not. And I'd like to be considered as somebody who loved good food, laughter, the company of my friends, and just generally a good old fat cook.
Well, I'm sure you're known as all those things now, so it can only continue. I've been hearing about your life, one of huge highs and lows, which, as you say, you would never have planned to be where you are now. You never thought that your life would take you in this direction. If we imagine you as you were when you were 18, and now, all these years later, you're in a very different place to the one that you might have chosen for yourself. It strikes me that, in a sense, God comes to us, meets us where we are, and improvises with the decisions that we've made, the circumstances of our lives. And considering those things, I thought it would be appropriate to end with jazz. The performer begins performing not necessarily knowing where he's going or she is going to be led. So it struck me that jazz would be a very appropriate way of closing this service. I think everybody will join me in thanking you for your candour and your honesty and your humour over this last hour. Are you going to say something?
I was going to say I might not have chosen where I ended up, but I'm perfectly happy with where I did.
Yes. Well, perhaps you'd all like to join me in giving thanks to Clarissa.